So we're really happy to have Justin McCurrick here. Design and Communication School has invited Justin in to speak about his work, about display and exhibition space and curating. So Justin McCurrick is a writer and curator based in London. He's the chief curator at the Design Museum in London, the director of Strekla Press, design critic for The Guardian, editor of Icon magazine, and the head of design curating and writing at the Design Academy, Eindhoven. So he's joining us here to talk, to give us insight on display, how to exhibit design work, and current trends and innovations in design. So welcome, we're really happy to have you.
Well, thank you very much, Heather, and thanks for inviting me. And thanks especially to Ilka for reaching out. Very nice to always speak to a new group. I thought actually before I share my screen, it would be nice to show you where I am because I haven't been here for months. This is the Design Museum. So you can see that it's empty. I don't know how many of you have been here, but it's very nice to be back in here myself. I'm not here because of the lecture, by the way. I'm here because an architect wanted to meet me here today. I was going to show him the space so we could think about an installation we're working on. And he just cancelled on me. So I cycled across London for no reason, except now I can pretend that I'm here just to show you the atrium. So that's nice. I can actually, and what I'll do is I'm going to go somewhere where it's a bit less echoey.
Okay.
So I will take you through to my office, also empty, well, more or less empty. I have one colleague here. So we're working from home at the moment. Yeah. Sometimes it's busier than this. I mean, at the moment, but Fridays, not so much. So this is the Design Museum, and it's something of a modernist icon. Finished in 1962. It was important because it was the first structure in the UK that had what's called a parabolic paraboloid roof. Hyperbolic paraboloid roof, I should say, which means it's a concrete roof which curves in two directions at the same time. So it was quite innovative at the time. When the Commonwealth Institute ceased to be a kind of functioning institution, the building was derelict for 10 years. And at a certain point, the Design Museum was looking to expand from its former banana ripening warehouse on Shad Thames near Tower Bridge. And this was the site that they chose to expand into. And I mean, I could talk about the building a lot. I won't because that's not why we're here. This is the space I just showed you. And it's how the museum looked when we first opened. This was right at the beginning. You can see that there's nothing on the walls. That atrium space had yet to be activated. Most of the action was happening in the galleries. You can see that top floor there. That's where the permanent collection is, and that's a kind of tour through the concept of design from three perspectives: the designers, the makers, and the users. And it includes things like this crowdsourced wall, which is a series of objects we asked the public to suggest what they felt should be in a design museum. And the results were strikingly appropriate, and it kind of reinforced the sense I had anyway, that design had come a long way in terms of people's understanding of what classic design was and what good design was. But anyway, these objects were chosen by the public. So it was an example of kind of reaching out to the public as a kind of curatorial act and inviting them to make a selection. And I say that because, it was quite an interesting proposition to open a new design museum in London in 2016. The original museum was founded in 1989. So it had been around for 27 years. It had actually started in the basement of the V&A as the Boiler House project. It's where Terence Conran initially funded a small mini contemporary. The idea was to do a kind of contemporary museum within a more historical focused V&A. And eventually the Design Museum initially horrified the V&A by including brands and branding and cars and things that the V&A wasn't so interested in. And so Conrad moved the museum to its own home, and eventually 30 years later expanded it into this home. And I was the incoming chief curator. That was the first chief curator at the museum, effectively. And I suppose the project when I joined a year before opening in 2015 was, how do we position this museum for the 21st century? And what do we take for granted and what do we not? So I'm showing you this image of, really obvious design pieces, because it felt like this is the kind of stuff the public expects to see in a design museum. Therefore, in thinking about an opening proposition, the opening exhibition, I thought this is exactly what we cannot do. This is exactly, we have to challenge people's preconceptions about what design is, and really try and bring the story up to date about what design is today. It's not about producing. It's not just about producing, popular, mass-produced consumer objects. Let's put it that way. And maybe, Heather and Ilker did ask me to say a few words about my background.
Yes, please.
So maybe I'll do that before I talk about this image. I started my career as a journalist. I trained as an art historian, spent 10 or 15 years as a journalist, a critic, an editor, running architecture magazines, running publishing houses, that kind of thing. As Heather mentioned, design critic for The Guardian. So, focused in design and architecture. And then I suppose my first real curatorial project was in 2012, when I curated an exhibition at the Venice Biennale of Architecture, which was about a skyscraper in Caracas in Venezuela, which was being squatted at the time by 3,500 people. So it was effectively the largest, and it was a 45-story skyscraper. So it was the tallest and kind of most extreme squat in the world. And that exhibition went on to win the Golden Lion at the Biennale. And then suddenly, I started to do more curating. And 3 years later, I was the chief curator at the museum, coming in, I would say, not as a museum person, but someone with a very broad cultural background who could influence various aspects of the museum, exhibitions, of course, but also public program and publishing. So that's where my kind of broad background came in handy, I suppose. So that's a kind of potted biography. And the image you're looking at now was the first exhibition at the old museum. And it was called Commerce and Culture. And it was curated by the then director, Stephen Bailey, in 1989. And it was, at least in hindsight, from my perspective, it was a fairly classic design exhibition, exploring a fairly classic relationship between commerce and culture. In other words, art and industry. And design is always positioned between these two things. And you can see the objects. These were historical household objects probably from the 1920s to the 1980s. And I ask you to take note of this chaise longue in the foreground. That chair, which at the time would have been labeled as a chair by Le Corbusier, designed in 1928. I'm going to talk about it later in relation to one of my exhibitions, but I won't talk about it now. The point of this slide is to say that, that was the story they were trying to tell in 1989. This idea, they were trying to get people to take seriously the idea that the things you find in shops are culture. Okay? And there weren't many museums trying to do that at the time. MoMA in New York was trying to do that, but there were design museums were still relatively thin on the ground in 1989. So from Commerce and Culture in 1989, we moved to my opening show at the Design Museum in 2016, which was called Fear and Love. And I suppose that there's a nice parallel there between these two something and something constructions. The purpose of this show was to try and reposition the audience's expectations about design what it is in the 21st century, the kind of problems it's tackling, and the kind of agency it has, and the stakes, the high stakes involved. So not so much about consumer goods anymore, or at least not the interesting stuff, but really designers taking on much bigger issues, much more complex issues, larger systems, and things that are not things that are not objects that you can buy in a shop, but are really processes or softwares or networks. So the way I always looked at this exhibition was that it was a post-object show. So it's a show not about objects. And the way I went about it was, I asked 11 designers and architects to present an installation that addressed an issue that they felt was urgent, and urgent and emotive, hence the fear and the love. And I'll talk a little bit about exhibition design today as well as I go through, because I think that's something that you might find interesting. And it's something that the Design Museum takes very seriously. And I think we probably do a lot more exhibition design in some senses than say the Tate or your traditional art museums, where design can be frowned upon if it is seen to kind of impinge on the aura of the artwork. And whereas with design, it's harder to show design in some senses without more design around it to contextualize it. I'll talk about this more later. Anyway, you can see this curtain. The gallery was divided up with this curtain designed by Sam Jacob, which was rather nice and based on a 1930s design by Lily Reich and Mies van der Rohe. Anyway, so 11 installations. Here's one looking at various issues. Here's one looking at automation. So there's literally an industrial robot in the middle of the gallery, and it's following you around, and it's engaging with visitors as they approach. So it's an intelligent robot, but that's been programmed not to do a repetitive task, but to engage with people as they come into the gallery and to try and create a relationship with them. It was quite amazing. It's incredibly powerful robot, zooming around, following people, chasing them, kind of trying to nuzzle up to them. It was amazing. And here's another installation, which was by a designer called Christine Mandertsma, and was looking at recycling in the fashion industry. Because, I mean, as you all know, fashion is one of the most polluting industries. I've heard it said it's the second most polluting, but I've also heard it said it's the fifth most polluting, and I'm not sure which is right. But anyway, here was someone looking at recycling. What she did was she took 1,000 woolen jumpers and she analyzed what was in the jumpers. And first of all, she found that a lot of the stuff was not what it said it was. And secondly, she reduced it into these colored piles, which she then went on to recycle into various. She's developed a whole tweed out of these and things. So it was this idea of looking at raw materials, looking at the process of fashion. This was an installation about made of Mongolian felt, which is looking at the situation faced by Mongolian nomads who are increasingly being urbanized and giving up their traditional lifestyles. There was an installation by Andres Hacker about Grindr, the gay dating app, and it was looking at how Syrian refugees were finding their way across Europe using this network of using Grindr as a way to find places to stay and people to help them. It was an amazing. It was actually a multi-screen film work, and it was really looking at how the unexpected uses of a dating app for refugees in strange countries in Europe, finding their way across countries they didn't know in Europe. It was really, really thought-provoking. And then this was just after Brexit, 2016. Well, it was not after the Brexit vote. And this was an installation by the architect Rem Koolhaas, looking at the influence of Europe on the interior. And the idea, it was kind of, the conceit was here's 27 objects from 27 European nations that make up a living room. So the idea that that you cannot nationalize, you cannot separate a nation culturally from its context. Every interior is made up of international elements.
Mm.
And then behind that European flag that they had designed, there's a picture of bombed out Rotterdam. It's a reminder of the last time that nationalism got out of control. And then, so this is just sorry, before I move on, let me just say that was a kind of, in a way, it was quite a provocative show. It was meant to be immersive and challenging and interesting and to kind of subvert people's expectations of what you might find in the design museum. And then really the question was, how do you build a program going forward? We were doing 4 or 5 shows a year. We still do 4 or 5 exhibitions a year. And I'll run through a few of those exhibitions and maybe just focus on one later and talk about the process of it a little bit more, because maybe that might be interesting.
Yeah.
So one example is here's a case where we invited a designer, a Dutch designer called Helle Jongerius, to do an exhibition in the museum. And this is part of a series that I had conceived where we would invite designers not necessarily to have a retrospective, not even necessarily to show the history of their work and so on. And here was a case where Helle Jongerius, I don't think she showed any of her actual products. She's a furniture designer and an interior designer and a textile designer. And what she did was she showed effectively 20 years worth of thinking about color. She wanted to make an exhibition about the behavior of color. And she created all of the works in the show specifically for this exhibition to show how color behaves. And she created what she calls these color catchers, which basically what she was trying to demonstrate was how unstable color is. And so all of these objects she created, these tubular objects you're looking at, they're all one color. It's just that the way they've been faceted makes it look like they're multiple colors. And what she's doing is she's showing that color is constantly changing. It's completely unstable, completely dependent on surface and light. And she's trying to get us to challenge this idea of industrialized color, stabilized color. And it was a very beautiful, poetic, immersive exhibition, but all really focused on how color behaves. So this was her looking at blacks, the series of vases she made, color studies. I think that's actually me in that picture. But anyway, so that was a case of a smaller, focused exhibition on. We have 2 galleries, right? So we have a main gallery which is trying to appeal to the broadest possible audience. That's where that first show was. And I wouldn't say that it appealed to the broadest possible audience, Fear and Love, but it had to be in the main gallery because it was our repositioning of design. This is in the smaller gallery, so probably more for people in the design, people more in the know. This exhibition, California Designing Freedom, was another one that I curated. This was in the main gallery. And it was really the first exhibition to look at the influence of California on design and technology. From the 1960s onwards, and was really exploring the shift from the counterculture in the 1960s and the way that a lot of that ethos about personal freedom and rebellion was fed into Silicon Valley, and as probably corporate bullshit, but still this idea that Silicon Valley has is the view that it has of itself of creating a better world. But it incorporated a lot of interesting stuff, artworks by Sister Karita Kent, a lot of graphic design, electronics, self-driving cars. Quite an ambitious show. And it did tour to a couple of other venues. And we've done shows about graphic design and politics. We did a show about the future of the home, or at least historical views of the future of the home. And then we started doing some really popular shows in 2019, like Stanley Kubrick. And the idea here was to look at the world building process in Kubrick's work. This idea that he worked with architects and designers, not just on the sets and the costumes, but really about in this way he had of trying to build a complete world around a picture, around a movie. This was hugely popular. I mean, off the scale popular. And then, you know, we did a show about electronic music last year, and that, and it was called From Kraftwerk to the Chemical Brothers. And again, this is a case of us trying to find an area that the public knows that it's interested in, and then to explain it to them from a design perspective, or to bring it, so not to explain, that's the wrong word, but to reveal the role of design in its relationship to electronic music, which is not just about album covers and graphic design, but it's really about the way that music becomes this audio-visual experience as we shift to DJs, because DJs and people working with electronic music are not very interesting to look at, right? It's not Mick Jagger, the charismatic frontman on stage. It's a guy at a computer, or in Kraftwerk's case, 4 guys at computers. So this whole new world emerges of audio-visual installations, and which mix graphic design and film. So we were really exploring that, and it was full of installations like this, you know, which synced to a really loud, booming soundtrack. And it was, again, I mean, it came out we opened this show in April when museums were allowed to open again. No, not in April, sorry, in July last year, when museums were allowed to open again. And, you know, maybe I'll just say a few words about the impact of coronavirus on museums. I mean, all of which you're aware. But, you know, especially a museum like the Design Museum, you know, we're not publicly funded. We're not government funded. So being closed is really damaging to us, because we survive partly through ticket sales and fundraising and enterprise activity and all of the things that we do. So being closed is really, you know, hits us hard. When this show opened, it was huge kind of wave of interest in it in the press. I mean, it just happened to coincide. We didn't know the pandemic was coming. We didn't know that all of kind of cultural life would be shut down, and that people would be locked in their homes, and that, you know, clubs and music venues would be shut down. And so when this show opened, it was like, oh my God, here's like almost like a vicarious way to go clubbing, a vicarious way to go out and have a social life. You couldn't do any of those things. So here was this exhibition about electronic music, and it just sold out. It kind of within weeks, the full run was sold out. And then we had to close again, and we've been closed since November, and museums can't open until mid-May. So, you know, there we were hoping to open in April, and so there we were keeping the exhibition alive, you know, keeping a lot of rental payments going to try and open in April. Originally we were hoping. Of course, now we can't open until May, and so, you know, what can I say? It's a tough situation. All museums are struggling with this. At least we did have our moment in the spotlight, which was wonderful. And now we're preparing to open again in May, and I'll start talking about something more specific rather than giving you this overview, because I thought maybe it would be fun to. This is a show that I'm curating, and I haven't curated a lot of the shows I showed you, like Kubrick and Electronic were not mine. I mean, of course, I oversee the program at the museum, but I curate fairly rarely now, because really it's quite hard to build the forward program and to be focused on an exhibition. Because when you're focused on an exhibition, it can be all-consuming, and it's very difficult to kind of keep your head above water and focus on what we should be doing in 3 years' time, because my job is really to be looking constantly 2 years ahead, 3 years ahead, because it takes 2 years to make an exhibition. So if we're focused in the present, we're not thinking enough about the future. But because of the pandemic, I had to move this exhibition forward, because we had to cancel it, because one show got canceled. We had to shuffle the program. Every museum has been shuffling the program like crazy over the last year. It's been hugely. You would think that with the museum closed, there was nothing for us to do, but actually, in some ways, it's never been busier, because we've had to manage so much uncertainty, and we've had to plan. The usual planning has had to be doubled. You have to kind of make plan Bs and plan Cs and all these kind of contingencies.
We hear you on that one. As
I'm sure you do. I'm sure it's the same at any institution.
Yeah.
And so here was an exhibition we wanted to do, and we moved it forward because one exhibition had to be cancelled, just circumstances around the pandemic. And so I've been curating this, and it's about Charlotte Perriand. And I don't know if you know, some of you will know Perriand, some of you might not.
Yeah.
She was one of the great modernist designers, so one of the great designers of the 20th century, certainly one of the great French designers, and certainly one of the great women designers of the 20th century. And, it's not interesting to make these distinctions between, women designers. Today, it's not interesting to make these distinctions, women designers and men designers. But in her day, and she came to prominence in the 1920s, she was very rare as, a designer who was, who managed to build a very successful career in her own right. And it's still rare to find that there are relatively few women designers of the 20th century that are household names, that can be held up as role models for designers today. And, for us, this is, although we have done a Charlotte Perriand show before, 25 years ago in the old museum, her reputation has certainly grown, and there's much new scholarship that's come to light around her over the last 25 years. And it felt like an opportune moment to do another show, to take another look at her life. And there was an exhibition at the Fondation Louis Vuitton in Paris last year and the year before, which was a huge event in Paris. And there was a big scholarly endeavor. And we felt it would be a shame to waste some of that scholarship. And so we worked with them and with the Perriand family to bring a more focused version to London. So that's what I've been working on. So this is a notorious photo of Charlotte Perriand wearing a ball-bearing necklace on the chaise longue she designed with Le Corbusier. Do you remember about half an hour ago I asked you to hold in your mind that image of the chaise longue from the first exhibition at the Design Museum? Well, this is that chair. And for most of its life, it was labeled designed by Le Corbusier. It was actually designed by this woman, Charlotte Perriand, who was working in Le Corbusier's studio at the time. And, her career was somewhat overshadowed by the famous male designers she collaborated with, people like Le Corbusier and Jean Prouvé. And so when I say that her reputation has kind of really grown in the last 25 years, it's because she's being given credit for the work that she did. Whereas for a long time, it was kind of subsumed under the name of Le Corbusier or Jean Prouvé. So it's a show opening in June. You can see a plan of the museum there, and you can see down here, this is the main gallery. So already we at this stage, this was an early concept document, but already we were laying out a kind of a narrative journey through the gallery, which I'll tell you more about later. So Perriand, emerged out of a decorative arts training in the 1920s, but came to light very quickly as a 24-year-old. She tried to work for the modernist master Le Corbusier, but he rejected her. When she showed up at his door, he took one look at her and said, "We don't embroider cushions here." Classic sexist, arrogant, male architect of the 1920s. He then saw an exhibition she staged, which was a recreation of her own studio apartment in Paris, realized that she was really quite something, incredibly talented and a born modernist, and hired her to design to design the furniture for his studio. And here's a picture of her wearing a ball-bearing necklace, which I find highly symbolic. I mean, ball bearings were really an emblem of the machine age, right? An emblem of machine efficiency. And here she is wearing them around her neck as a necklace, wearing a piece of industrial machinery around her neck. And it's really signaling her as a quintessential modern woman. And this is you can see the revolving chair, which also used ball bearings. Revolving chair that she designed for her own apartment. This is the studio apartment in Paris. all chrome and steel and leather and glass, all very modernist materials. And that appealed to Le Corbusier because he was a believer in the machine aesthetic, and so she designs all the furniture with him. I should say it's a collaboration, but she does the detailed work on these pieces of furniture, which become modernist classics. They're really icons of modernist design and icons of the machine age. Bent steel furniture. So it was all very new, all an avant-garde assault on the traditional bourgeois home, which was made of heavy carved wood and so on. So here these things are supposed to be lighter, more aerodynamic, freeing up more space in the home. Much colder materials, you might say, metal and glass, but spatially very dramatic. So this room you can see here on the left is the room they designed for the exhibition at the Salon Dorton in 1929. It's a very famous interior. It was never a real interior. It was an exhibition. It was always an exhibition. Anyway, we're recreating that room in the exhibition. And we're also showing a lot of her process. At the Design Museum, we love to show the thinking process of designers. So we're showing her notebooks, her sketches, her collages. And this is actually stuff that wasn't so much on display in Paris, which is very much about her finished objects and her relationship with famous artists like Leger and Picasso. We're focusing on her. These are some of her drawings. Again, she's still really working in the Corbusian style. She's designing for Le Corbusier. This is the Villa Martinez in Buenos Aires. And then in the 1930s, she gives up on metal and the machine, and it would start to become associated with the negative sides of industrialization, like industrial scale warfare, the Spanish Civil War, the mechanization of warfare. And she starts to look at nature. She's an outdoorsy person. She's photographing rocks and trees, and it starts to influence the way she designs. And she starts to design, heavy wooden crafted tables. And she spends 2 years in Japan in the 1940s, and she becomes heavily influenced by Japanese materials and spaces, especially the very spacious emptiness of the Japanese home. Then in the 1950s, her thesis really, and sorry, I'm rushing through her kind of career and her kind of manifesto, but she has two things that are really driving her. One is trying to find the balance between industry and craftsmanship. So, and you might say between metal and wood, between parts that you can industrially produce and parts that are handcrafted. And let's see if there's a good example. So this bookcase is probably one of the quintessential examples. She's trying to find ways of creating modern modular furniture. So furniture made of standardized parts that are not all craftsmanship, heavy carved wood, that can be mass produced, affordable for a kind of growing middle class. So here's a bookcase designed for what's basically a student dormitory in Paris. It goes on to become a modernist icon. I mean, this bookcase, if you find it in auction now, it's going to be hundreds of thousands of pounds, which is ironic because it was designed to be a relatively cheap, affordable bookcase for a student dormitory, right? So this is how the kind of agenda of modernism has been warped by the market. But anyway, so her two real agendas are modular, mass-produced, relatively easy to produce furniture for a growing middle class, reconciling industrially produced, these are metal parts with wooden shelves, so trying to reconcile industry and craftsmanship, but also she had this thesis called the synthesis of the arts, which is that architecture, design, and art need to work together to create the complete interior. That especially architecture and design need to work together. You can't, her idea is you don't just design a space, a building, an interior, and then choose the furniture to go in it. But the two things need to be designed at the same time. And that art and design are on the same level. There's no high art and low art. That artists are also workers of a kind, just like the constructivists thought. And so art, design, and architecture need to work in unison, in synthesis. That's one of her beliefs. And so we're creating a number of interiors, recreating a number of interiors. That modernist one I showed you from 1929, this student dormitory, this office she designed for Air France in London in 1957. So always in this exhibition, we're going to be jumping in and out of full-scale recreations and smaller objects. And also she was an architect. So she was known mainly as a furniture designer in the 20th century. Now I would say she was really the first interior architect. She's really, I would say, the first person who's thinking about the interior in an architectural way, like an architect would, but also as a furniture designer. And a lot of her architecture is designed for leisure, so for cheap weekend homes or mountain refuges. And ultimately, she designs the prototypical ski resort, which is Les Arcs, which is a massive project at multiple levels of the mountain for 30,000 people. And it's all her, and she's leading it, So she is a tremendous force. She's also, and I think this is one reason why she's a great role model, she's a great collaborator. So I'm going to skip now to the design part. How are we doing for time, Heather? Let's have a look.
It's 12:42. How are you doing for time?
I'm okay, but I want to leave some room for questions. So maybe I'll just take 5 minutes on this.
Sure.
About the process, and then we can skip to some questions, because I appreciate I'm covering a huge amount of ground.
Yeah.
Which isn't always helpful.
Fascinating though, but yeah. So we'll leave some room for questions.
Here's a plan of our main gallery, and I'm showing you this because this is something that we are not like the Royal Academy, right? We don't have a series of rooms which we then populate with objects. What we have is a big empty gallery, and then we build walls as we need them, and we try and keep those walls as much as we can, because, within reason, because it's expensive and wasteful to build walls and knock them down. And increasingly, we're becoming much more conscious of, our environmental impact, and we try and reduce waste. So, so just to give you an idea, this central spine wall here has been there for multiple shows, through Kubrick, through electronic. And so we tend to keep that. But there are some elements here that we've added because there are certain rooms need very specific spaces. So this is an older plan. It's been updated, but it just gives you an idea of how we work and the visitor journey. So we commissioned Assemble, the architecture collective, who won the Turner Prize a few years ago. We commissioned them to design the Charlotte Perriand exhibition. And the first thing they have to do is they have to design a space that fits the narrative journey that we've supplied to them. So we say, this is the story we want to tell. These are probably the rooms that we need, and you design the space to match that journey. So you come in this entrance corridor here. Can you see my cursor when I do this?
Yes.
Okay, so you come in the entrance space here. You enter this first room, which you'll see the ball-bearing necklace. You'll see some early works, and you'll see a recreation of a piece of her Paris studio. I showed you the photograph of it at the beginning. Then you'll come through, and you'll see the famous, iconic furniture she designs with Le Corbusier from that in 1928. This big plinth here is dedicated to her drawings, a series of drawings she did for this furniture. And we're really elevating these drawings on a big plinth because we're trying to put the process at the heart of the exhibition. Then you'll come through, and the big first set piece you encounter is the Salon Dorton room. I showed you that photo of it. It's a full-scale historic recreation. We've worked with Casina, which is the company that holds her the right to produce our furniture, and they've got all the studies. So we recreated this room, and in this room you'll be able, obviously these things are incredibly precious here, and you won't be able to touch anything in the show. But in this room, because of the furniture has been reissued, you'll be able to sit on her furniture. You'll be able to see what her swivel chair is like, what her armchair is like, even what the chaise longue is like. And you won't be able to go into this bedroom, bathroom, and kitchen here, but in the living room here, you'll be able to try out her furniture, which is quite rare in a design museum when you're looking at historic work. Then you'll come through a room here, which is about the beginnings of her architectural projects. And then you enter the biggest room in the exhibition, which is this middle phase of her career, when she starts to shift to her focus to nature and wood and craftsmanship. And so you can see these islands. I'll talk about them in a moment. But each of these islands is a kind of phase of her career. So the natural phase, there's a phase here in Japan, there's a second Japan moment here. And then you come through this phase, and then you enter the third section, which starts here. This is where we're talking about modular design, and there's a little room here devoted to the kind of modular bookshelf. Here's the student dormitory. You'll come through. This is the stuff about the synthesis of the arts. You'll come through here. You'll enter a full-scale recreation of the Air France agency in London. And then we end on her grandest project, which is Les Arcs. Okay, so sorry, that's just a very quick tour of the gallery. This is how we start to work with designers. We do a plan we do a floor plan, but we're also doing elevations at the same time. So we need to somehow be able to think about how we're positioning works on the wall. So what you're looking at here is a folded out gallery with this was an early attempt to position some things on the wall while also positioning things on the floor. This is just one room. This is the big room from the middle career. Then the graphic designers, the architects start to produce a couple of visualizations. So they're experimenting here with color on the walls, with plinths. So you can see that the way they're working with these plinths is they're using these essentially construction blocks, but they're not your standard breeze block. They're actually a calcium silicate block. They're a bit more refined. And one of the reasons they did this is because we asked them to think about how we could reduce the environment, reduce the waste effectively produced by exhibitions. Traditionally, in an exhibition, you create a lot of MDF plinths, which then can't be reused and have to be thrown in a skip. So the idea behind these blocks was that they're modular, right? Like Perriand is also aiming to create modular furniture. They created modular plinths so that we buy the blocks, then you can just take the blocks away and reuse them for something else afterwards, either for more plinths in future exhibitions, or Assemble can use them in a construction project. So hopefully there'll be no waste. But it's also quite an interesting way of creating plinths, quite unusual. Let me see if there's a slide here that talks about that. No, there isn't. Okay, different presentation. But so they're modeling, they're starting to model the shape of the plinths with the blocks. They started off with these organic forms, but of course, when you make them out of blocks, they become quite angular. But you can see the shape of the plinth is roughly echoing the kind of organic shape of the furniture. Then they're starting to model putting some of these pieces on the plinth. They also made a paper model, or a kind of foam and paper model, which is very useful in terms of starting to get a sense of what these spaces are going to feel like. Obviously in miniature, but it's quite fun to see this little doll's house model of the gallery with little doll's house pieces of furniture in it. This is that entry space I showed you. So they're experimenting with, how that's going to feel, putting a little domestic scale door in. Yeah. At some point, they were thinking about different materials. This was crazy stuff. We actually had to say no to this, but they were experimenting with mop heads and trying to create something more organic, which I didn't feel was quite right. But Perriand herself took a lot of she had a lot of fun with exhibition design. I mean, she used to show her pieces on raked sand in Japan quite a lot, and creating these little islands of raked sand as if it was a kind of Japanese garden or a Zen garden. These days, we wouldn't be able to put furniture on sand because there are all kinds of condition factors we have to meet. If we borrow an object, we have to, of course, undertake to look after that object. Here's that experiment with mop heads, which I didn't think worked. And in the end, we just went with the straight blocks, and but they're very beautiful blocks. And you can see it's a bit like a Carl Andre sculpture. You can see there.
The blocks are lovely.
Yeah, and they're experimenting here with
the mops. Why did they propose the mops? Do you know?
Because we felt that what we were encouraging was this idea that the blocks originally were for the first section, which is much more about the machine age and industrial manufacturing, and so it seemed to work. But effectively, like designers often do, they try and come up with a mode that works across the whole exhibition, and you don't have to do different things in different rooms. So they decided to continue it through the exhibition, but we felt we wanted something to soften this in the second section that felt more fitting with that phase of her work, less industrial, a bit warmer. And so they were thinking about things to put on top of the blocks that you could put the furniture on. We were thinking about rugs or felt, I think they were, they're quite I'm sure Assemble's work, some of you, and they're quite playful. So they were experimenting with the mops. We didn't think that was going to work. I think now that they're just sitting directly on the blocks, maybe with some acetate underneath. This is some experiments of different blocks. We went for a much finer block. Here's some. So they had to persuade. So the thing is, when you're doing an exhibition design, persuading the curators is actually the easy bit. Persuading the project managers is the hard bit, because the project managers are the ones who are kind of responsible for, just all the practical elements around an exhibition. They're particularly concerned about what lenders are going to think, and so it's important to show them precedents. So of course they're horrified by the idea of the block in the beginning, because they're thinking, but people can pick that block up and they can just kind of like pick up blocks and dismantle our plinths or drop it on their foot, or they're thinking about the safety of objects. And that might sound silly, but we have found that people do crazy things in exhibitions.
They do.
Particularly in a design museum, because some people, if you go to an art museum, I think it's kind of understood that you can't touch things by and large. But if you go to a design museum and you see something that might be a chair or a household object, something maybe you even have at home, if you're not used to going to museums, how do you know that you're not supposed to touch that thing?
And in this exhibition, you're going to have interactive bits and not interactive sections, so that could cause some confusion.
Exactly, and then sometimes you're encouraging them to touch things, and sometimes you're forbidding them from touching things. So it's quite a difficult space to negotiate. Here's a Franz West exhibition at the Tate Modern, which was designed by Sarah Lucas, actually, and Sarah Lucas was also using these blocks, as you can see, as kind of plinths. And the plinths are serving multiple roles. They're elevating the base plinth here is elevating the objects, but it's also keeping people away from the objects, because you have to keep people at least a meter away. So it's fun. It's kind of fun to think about these things. It's also very annoying to think about these things, because you can never quite do exactly what you want to do, because you've got to somehow constantly preempt what some crazy visitor is going to do. And the crazy ones are definitely in the minority, but they exist.
They do.
And so here's some early experiments with a much rougher block, which of course made the project managers very nervous, because blocks contain moisture, and so all of that has to be stored in the gallery to be dehumidified for a couple of months before we do the installation. They're experimenting with, how they create little islands and different levels. Again, these are not the blocks we're using. But anyway, that gives you a little insight into the process of trying to design an exhibition.
Justin, thank you so much for taking us through the journey from, concept, a bit of the history, through to kind of just the materials that are being used for the exhibition design. I'm sure that a lot of the students will find this very useful. Take care.
Talk to you soon. Bye.
See you at the museum.
Thank you.
Bye.